Hello and welcome to Topic 2, Lecture 2. And in this lecture, we're going to be learning about the founding and the United States Constitution. So, what are we going to be learning about in this lecture? Well, first, we're going to talk about the movement from the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, which is the first Constitution of the United States, to the Constitution that we have today, which is the United States Constitution. Then we're going to focus on the United States Constitution. We're going to take a look at the outline of the Constitution so you have an understanding of the different articles, just like an overview, as well as the amendments. And then we're going to dig in and we're going to talk about what I call the architecture of democracy. Remember, in our previous lectures from Topic 1, we talked about how the founders created a constitution to put brakes on the abuse of power to make it more stable. And so we're going to see how that plays out in specific in this lecture. So that's what we've got on the docket. Let's go ahead and get started. So to best understand the United States Constitution, it's important that we take a look at the first Constitution of the United States. And the first Constitution of the United States is the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. This Constitution was approved by the Second Continental Congress in 1777. And so the Second Continental Congress was like the de facto national government during the Revolutionary War. And so they approved, you fight a revolution, but you also need to have a constitution for this new nation that you're creating. And that's what the Articles of Confederation was. So it was approved in 77, it was ratified by the states in 1781, and it was the Constitution of the United States until the ratification of the United States Constitution in 1788. Now, like many constitutions, it basically it's a blueprint for the government of a nation. And so it basically established the governmental institutions of this new nation and identified their powers. So let's now turn our sights to what the goals of this first constitution was and where this constitution had some problems, thus having a relatively short life as a constitution. So the main goals of the Articles of Confederation were to magnify the power of the states, to give the states a lot of power, and to create a national government, but to create a national government that had very, very limited power. And it almost goes without saying why that was the case. I mean, the colonies just came out of being ruled by the British monarchy with, at times, a heavy hand, and definitely they understood what it was like to have power consolidated in the hands of one individual, a king. And so they really did not want to replicate that kind of consolidation of governmental power in the hands of like a very powerful national government. And so this was achieved by in a couple of ways within this new constitution. One is it's called the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union for a reason, because the word confederation means something, and the Articles of Confederation creates a confederation. And basically what a confederation is when you have units like states that have they are the sovereign authority, okay? So, and things can't get done at the national level unless the states agree to it, okay? And each state had one vote, and a lot of decisions needed to be made either with, a 3/4 majority or a unanimous consent of the states. And so the states have the sovereign authority except for powers that were expressly granted to the national government through the Articles of Confederation. And those powers were very limited. For one, there was only one institution of federal government under the Articles of Confederation, We have three, right? This Constitution had only one, and it was called the Congress of the Confederation. And so it basically had a decision-making branch. It had a legislature, but there was no executive branch. There was no president like we know today. There was a president of the Confederation or the Congress of the Confederation, but that would be sort of more like the Speaker of the House. And there was no federal judiciary. Matters were really left to the states. The federal government, the national government was very limited in its power. Congress could declare war and create treaties and appropriate money, but 9 out of the 13 states had to agree with that. The national government had no standing army. They could only have a standing national army with the state's consent, which they didn't get. So basically, the defense of the United States was left to the state militias. They couldn't raise taxes. They could ask the states if you want to raise taxes, but if they didn't want to, they couldn't. So, it provides a very limited power base for this national government, which is what these new states wanted. They didn't want a really powerful national government, but we're going to see that causes problems. So the extreme limits that were placed on the power of the national government under the Articles of Confederation really made that document and that Constitution pretty impractical and unworkable given the challenges that were facing this new nation. For one, that the United States really had was really struggling with financial stability. Coming out of the war, the Revolutionary War, the United States had a really large war debt. They needed to pay off their allies, in particular France, that helped them fight and win this war. But the national government couldn't raise taxes without the approval of the states, and the states weren't giving that approval. And so that there was a lot of concern about the United States' financial stability. That also there was concerns about whether or not the national government could actually conduct foreign affairs. That the national government could make treaties, but they really couldn't enforce those treaties because they didn't have a national army, right? And so they lacked sort of that power. Plus, states could negotiate directly with other countries, and so it was sort of like, well, the international arena was sort of like, well, who's in charge here, the national government or the states? Okay. And then, states had their own troubles, that they were in parts getting very radical, that they were, raising high taxes. They were taking away farms and foreclosing on farms. And that led to some strife, which you'll read about in your textbook with Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts in 1787. And there was no national government to go to step in and make sure that that kind of strife didn't harm other states. And so the writing was sort of on the wall that this Constitution maybe isn't working out, and that maybe perhaps it needed to be amended. So in 1786, state delegates attended what's known as the Annapolis Convention, and this was a convention that brought together state delegates to discuss the problems with the Articles of Confederation. And what happens coming out of that Annapolis Convention is that there's a call for another convention, constitutional convention. And they decide to send delegates to Philadelphia with the goal of revising the Articles of Confederation, although we know that that's not what happened. And so the Constitutional Convention comes out of that the Annapolis Convention. And once at the Constitutional Convention that started in 1787, once they started revising it, the articles, they said, you know what, the revision is not enough. We're going to need an entirely new constitution for the United States. All right, so that brings us to taking a look at the Constitutional Convention. What was some of the conflicts and compromises that were made in Philadelphia at that Constitutional Convention in order to get the Constitution ratified. But before we go in and take a look at some of those issues, let's just take a look at the outline of the Constitution, how many articles they are, and how it's organized. Okay, so let's take a look at the outline of the Constitution. And we'll be referring, obviously, to the different articles throughout the course of the semester, okay? Particularly when we get to learning about the institutions of government, Congress, the executive branch, the judiciary, but also when we're talking about the federalism, when we're talking about the relationship between the states. So the Constitution has 7 articles, okay? And that is the original, that is what was the 7 articles of the Constitution is what was originally ratified by the states by 1788, okay? And so, but then there is a provision within the articles for how to amend the United States Constitution. So clearly we have some amendments as well, but really not a lot of amendments. It's very difficult to amend the Constitution of the United States. And today, I mean, given how polarized things are in Congress, the chances and within the state governments, the chances of amending the Constitution is really, there's probably, a 5% chance that it would happen. So we have 27 amendments. The first 10 amendments is what's known as the Bill of Rights. Okay, we learned that in our last lecture, and we're really going to be digging into the Bill of Rights when we get to our section on civil liberties, on our chapter on civil liberties. And the first 10 amendments were ratified in the 1790s. Okay, and so really since then there have only been 17 additional amendments, and many of which took place during the Civil War. So, we haven't had a lot of amendments to the Constitution. We can debate whether that is a good thing or a bad thing. So the first 3 articles, they establish the institutions of government, okay? And so when we talk about Congress, how it's organized, what the qualifications for membership are, what are the powers of Congress, the express powers of Congress, we'll be talking a lot about Article 1 in that section, because Article 1 tells us all the powers, the organization, the qualifications to serve in Congress. Article 2 is dedicated to the presidency, okay? And the federal bureaucracy, there's not like an Article 2, plus 1 or something that talks about the federal bureaucracy. The federal bureaucracy develops because of the power that's outlined in Article 2, okay? And so when we get to the presidency, we're going to be talking about all of the Article 2 powers that the president has. And then Article 3, that talks about the federal judiciary, okay? And the federal judiciary, Article 3, is primarily telling us what the powers of the Supreme Court are, but it's also telling us that Congress has the power to make lower level federal courts, okay? And that's who has the power, and that is established in Article 3. Moving on, Article 4, that when we get to federalism, Article 4 tells us about the states. For one, it tells us how a state can be admitted to the union, okay? And so like Hawaii and Alaska, it's been a while since we admitted a state, but a lot of people, think that Puerto Rico should be admitted as a state. So maybe in our lifetime, we might see that. And same with the District of Columbia. It also tells us about the relationship between states, okay? That because there was sort of conflict between the states under the Articles of Confederation, we want to make sure that we understand that there is going to be some cooperation between the states within, and that comes through Article 4. Article 5 tells us how to amend the Constitution. You can read more about that in the textbook. Article 6, it tells us what the legal status of the Constitution is, right? And so, when you create a Constitution, you have to basically say, like, what level of law is the Constitution? And the answer to that is that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, okay? All state law, all local law, all county law, all national law, it needs to not offend what is in the Constitution. That is the supreme law of the land. It comes before everything else, and that is established in Article 6. And then Article 7 tells us about the criteria for ratifying the Constitution. Okay, so Article 7, that was really just specific to that time period. And it said that 9 of the 13 states were needed to ratify the Constitution. But all 13 states finally did ratify the Constitution. And so that just gives you a broad outline of what those different articles in the Constitution, what they apply to. States Constitution. Oh, Jesus Christ. so the framers, given their understanding of human nature as being prone to abuse power, if that power is not checked, that the framers are those who went to the Constitutional Convention and actually created this document. That's what the framers refer to. That they knew that they needed to create a mechanism of government within this Constitution, like a blueprint of a democratic government, and I call it the architecture of democracy, that would address these dangers, right? These perceived dangers that could bring a democracy to its knees. And so one of the things they were concerned about is that once you get in the majority, you're going to run ramshackle over those who are in the minority, right? You're not going to take their interests into consideration. Majority rules, majority rules, majority rules. You can do whatever you want. Well, they thought that you shouldn't do whatever you want, but we're not going to wait for you to be like a moral actor, a virtuous actor. We're just going to make it really difficult for the majority to rule. And so that they designed this Constitution to give power to those not in the majority. And probably the best example of that is the way our legislature is constructed, okay? The House of Representatives is based on population, majority rules. The bigger your state is, the more voice you get in the House of Representatives. But that's not the case in the Senate. In the Senate, every state gets 2 votes, right? And so it actually gives smaller states more of a voice in Congress. And so then that sort of makes it so to get things done, you need to have more than just majority rule, because states get equal say within the Senate. They also wanted to reduce opportunities for people to directly rule. That when it came to how we elected the House of Representatives, the people did directly vote for the members of the House of Representatives, but not for the Senate. Initially, that was left to the states. State legislatures were the ones who picked their senators, right? And so people didn't get to vote for who their senators were going to be. Now, we amended the Constitution, so that's not the case anymore, right? But that, it is a way to reduce those opportunities for the people to have a direct say in democracy. The Electoral College is a really good example of that as well. As we know, you can win the majority of the vote, but not become the president of the United States. And so the Electoral College is designed to give more voice to those smaller states, okay? And that they wanted power to be diffuse and with lots of checks on that governmental power. So let's see how these concerns played themselves out on the floor of the Philadelphia Convention Hall, right? And then let's talk about how the broader concepts of separation of power and checks and balances that are key to that architecture of democracy. Okay, so as you know that from probably your high school history classes or your college history classes or reading the textbook, that at the Constitutional Convention, different plans were presented about how the Constitution should be organized, right? And that there were 2 major plans that were discussed at the convention. One is the Virginia plan, okay, and that's kind of the plan that came forth from those states that were the most populous. And let me just put these up here so we can just talk about them and I don't have to click away. And so we've got the Virginia plan, okay? The Virginia plan benefited large states. Why? Because that it was, for the Virginia plan, all representation was going to be based on population. So that was true that they did want to have a bicameral. That means a 2-chamber, 2 chambers, 2 lawmaking chambers, but that both would be based on population, okay? And so not only would the states that had the most population get the most, representation in Chamber 1, but they would in Chamber 2 as well. That they gave a lot of power to Congress, again, sort of expanding the power of the most populous states. And also they wanted a parliamentary style of government, which we're going to talk a little bit more in a moment. But a parliamentary style of government is like what they have in Britain. It's like you have the House of Commons, and then out of the House of Commons, they select a prime minister, okay? And so that whichever party has the most power in the House, right, of Commons, or in this case, on the Virginia plan, whoever has the most power within the legislature, they would select who the president would be, right? And so it really was doubling down on power, 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 which is sort of like brings to light, those concerns about human nature. The New Jersey plan is sort of seen as the small states plan, okay? In this, it benefited the small states, and as such, the states were equal players. There was going to be one legislative branch, so we'd have a unicameral form of government, and that in that unicameral legislature, every state had the same level of votes. And that they wanted power to be separated out. They didn't want the executive branch to spring forth from the legislative branch and basically be beholden to the legislative branch. They wanted the executive, the judicial, and the legislature to be divided, to be separated out. The compromise, right? The days when we could actually compromise was known as the Connecticut Plan. And so it was a bicameral legislature, two houses, the House and the Senate, and that the House of Representatives was based on population. So tip of the hat to or bow to the Virginia Plan. But the Senate would be based on that all states would get equal representation within the Connecticut Plan. It was also based on separation of powers as well. And that is the plan that basically became the underpinnings for the United States Constitution. Okay, so this brings us to talking about these concepts that are really important to understanding how the United States Constitution, what the values were behind the way that the Constitution was structured. Separation of powers and checks and balances. So let's talk about separation of powers. First, one of the two checks on power, on the abuse of power. Now, as I mentioned the last slide, in some democracies, example being Britain, right, that the powers are merged, okay? And that's what's known as a parliamentary form of government. And what that basically means is as I mentioned, that you have, the legislative power is basically merged with the executive power, okay? And so you have the House of Commons, and then whichever party has the most members in the House of Commons, then the leader of that party becomes the prime minister, and then members of parliament go and serve within that prime minister's cabinet. And if the House of Commons thinks that the prime minister is not doing a good job, then they can have a vote of no confidence, right, and remove that person. And so that's a merger of power, and that our framers were worried that was an unstable kind of government. For one, it puts too much power in the hands of one institution, right, because that whoever has the majority in the House of Commons, then they automatically get to have the power in the executive branch. Now, there might be some benefits to that because you can get stuff done. You also sort of know which party to hold accountable rather than finger pointing. But that's not what the framers wanted. They thought that the choosing separation of powers, that is dividing power into separate groups that then must cooperate to make decisions. They felt that was the best way of keeping a check on excessive power. And so, that division of powers is you have legislative power that's in the legislature, executive power that's given to the executive branch, and then the judiciary. Article 1, Article 2, Article 3, they're separate branches, they have separate powers. That's separation of power. So, from the framers' perspective, they really felt that it was important to have separation of powers because each institution has its own distinct powers. And so there's only certain powers that Congress has, the power to declare war. There's only certain powers that the president has to nominate executive members, like members of the court, right? Only the president is the commander-in-chief over the armed forces. And so they have their distinct powers. They have different terms, the House 2, the Senate 6, the president 4, and they're elected in different ways as well. And they thought that this was good because basically, if there was like a frenzy that took over a nation, right? If you had elections every 2 years or every 4 years, because that is every term was 4 years, that could basically make it so that the power of the zeitgeist of that time period could really, change government, right? And it would maybe that might be an abuse of power, right? The people are saying out with the old, in with the new, and maybe that could be destabilizing. But it's also, if you have your own distinct powers, if the presidency tries to come over and do an Article 1 power for the Congress is going to say, get the F out of our lane. Those are our powers, okay? You don't write the budget. You don't pass, you don't decide how much money goes. We write it and then you approve it, right? And so it's easier to hold accountable. If laws aren't getting enacted, if they're not being passed, you blame Congress, right? If they're being passed but they're not being appropriately implemented, then you would, blame the executive branch. And so those varied terms and elections put brakes on excessive democracy, and that also there's this competition between the branches, that the branches hold each other accountable. Kind of works with human nature, right? Because you become like identified with your Article 2 powers or your Article 3 powers if you're in the court, and that you don't want any of the other branches getting into your power. And that basically does put this a check on the abuse of power. So this is just a handy chart from your textbook that basically shows you the distinct powers that each branch of government has. And so here, the legislature, they pass laws, approve treaties, regulate interstate commerce. The executive enforces laws, it commands over the army, appoints Supreme Court justices, and then the judiciary, its main power is to decide the constitutionality of law. And so there are clear separations between what those branches can do. The other key feature of the United States Constitution is checks and balances. And basically what checks and balances are is that it creates a check on government power. It's an effort to forge compromise because each branch participates and influences in the decision-making of the other branch. In other words, one branch can't exercise its power without the oversight or the participation of another branch. And so, for example, that the legislature has, oversight over the executive branch. The legislature, the United States Congress, can override a veto, so that if they pass a law and the president vetoes it, the legislature can override that veto. Okay, and so that sort of maybe encourages the legislative branch to work with the executive branch to pass a law that both sides are comfortable with. If they feel like the executive is abusing their power, then they can exercise their impeachment and removal powers. The executive also has power over a check on the power of the legislature. The executive can veto. The vice president of the United States ends if there is a tie within the Senate. And so that allows the executive branch to have a little bit of say in terms of the legislative activities of Senate. And the president can call special sessions of Congress to have them deal with particular matters. And then the judiciary has oversight over both the legislative and the executive branch, and that they can exercise judicial review, which we will learn about later in the semester. Judicial review is just basically the power that the Supreme Court has to overturn laws or to nullify laws or executive actions that violate the Constitution. And so they really do have a tremendous power, but it also leads to compromise in a way that the legislative branch doesn't want to pass a law that's going to likely be considered unconstitutional, so they'll work in order to make a law that is constitutional, and same with the executive branch. And here is just a handy chart that illustrates sort of these checks and balances, right? How the legislature has power over the executive, or let me put my magic pen on. How the legislator has power over the executive. How the legislature has power over the judiciary, okay? How the judiciary has power over the executive branch, etc. So I'll let it to you to sort of read through that chart. So in conclusion, I'd like to talk a little bit about thinking critically about this architecture and maybe reflecting on how strong is this structure of American democracy. Now, the framers were really concerned about majority rule and excessive democracy. We were just talking about that. They wanted to make sure that the majority alone wasn't enough to get things done. You needed like a supermajority, right? They also didn't want people to get a say, right? They were worried about lots of opportunities for the people to be directly heard. Today, one might say that we have opposite concerns. Today, I think a lot of people are worried not about tyranny of the majority, but tyranny of the minority. That is, those that are in the minority are thwarting, the desires of those in the majority. We talked about that on the last lecture, where what the people want in terms of public opinion doesn't oftentimes get translated into federal law. And so some are sort of saying we're kind of living in a counter-majoritarian form of government. That is when the minority can consistently thwart the will of the majority. And I wonder whether the framers might come back and say, well, that's not exactly what we had in mind. We wanted some breaks on the will of the majority, but not to the point where the majority and the will of the majority doesn't get adequately reflected in the laws of that nation. And so a couple of things, that I want to talk about what contributes to that counter-majority and majoritarianism is, well, one, the Senate has a filibuster, right? And so that in order to get any law passed in the Senate, you have to have 60 senators, right? And that's basically out of 100, that's a supermajority. And so also given how divided and partisan and polarized our parties are, it's very difficult to come up with 60 senators to get laws passed. So a lot of people think that filibuster kind of contributes to that counter-majoritarianism. Another aspect is sort of the makeup of the Senate. When the Constitution was created, that the ratio between the most populous state and the least populous state was a lot different. In 1790, the ratio was 12-1. And so that the most populous state was 12 times that of the least populous state. Today, it's 68-1. So that the largest state is 68 times the size of the smallest state. And that, as it says there, by 2040, that 70% of the population will live in 15 states and have 30% representation in Senate. And so there's some concerns there too that, yes, the Senate was there to put the brakes on majority rule. However, that there are, some states like California and Texas and Florida and Illinois that, New York that have very big populations. But their power in the Senate is greatly thwarted by, states like, Wyoming and Montana and Vermont that, have very small populations, but still end up getting the same amount of representation to senators in the Senate. Also, some think that the recent Supreme Court decisions are also sort of counter-majoritarian, that they don't reflect that the United States is pretty much 50-50 in terms of liberal and conservative, or maybe, when you ask people how they lean, but the court is heavily conservative. So some might say that there might be a counter-majoritarian aspect to that as well. And when it comes to putting the brakes on excessive democracy, as I mentioned before, there are a lot of concerns over the indirect election of the president via the Electoral College, where we see, and since 2000, we've seen two presidents who become president of the United States who did not, get the majority of the vote. And then finally, due to tribes and the polarization, that the checks and balances oftentimes don't lead to compromises. That those checks are supposed to put a brake on that, to lead towards compromise, and let's get things done. And, parties are pretty dug in, and that's true both for the Democrats and the Republicans. Makes it difficult to work in a bipartisan manner. All right, those are just some things to think about here critically at the end. Thanks for listening, and I will talk to you again soon.